welcome to episode 217 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Nathan Smith,
Lydia Creech,
and today we are joined by special guest Mike Thorn. Mike, thanks for jumping on with us.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
So in part one, we're going to do something a little bit different. If for those who checked out Twitter and Facebook this past week or the website, we had Mike's film Twitter favorite horror films list. The top, what was it? Is it 50 or is it 100? I forgot.
150.
150. So top 100.
Or actually, it's like 162 titles, I think, or something like that.
It's a very
There's a lot of ties.
Very expansive list, but we had that on the website, so we're going to talk a little bit about that, look through the top 10, kind of parse through how we feel about how the movies came out in part 1, and then part 2 we will be continuing our Horror by Women series with 1999's The Rage, Carrie 2. But yeah, let's jump into this list before we kind of start talking about it. I'll run through the top 10. Number 1 was John Carpenter's The Thing. Number 2 was The Shining. Number 3 was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974. Number 4 was Alien. Number 5 was Halloween. Number 6 was The Exorcist. Number 7 was Suspiria. Number 8 was Dawn of the Dead. Number 9 was Psycho. And number 10 was Rosemary's Baby. So yeah, I guess Mark, I'll start with you. How did you feel? Were you good with The Thing leading this list? Was that one that you had on your own list?
The Thing was not on my own list, but I mean, I love Carpenter. I mean, who doesn't? Prince of Darkness was my pick for Carpenter, but it's cool to see it take the spot over The Shining. Those two were like neck and neck. I was kind of hoping to see Texas Chainsaw Massacre take the lead. Yeah, that one got a few less votes than The Thing and The Shining, but I mean, they're all great films. The Shining doesn't speak to me as much personally, although I really admire it. I think I might have some hang-ups because I'm such a big fan of the novel, so that's not so much a fault of the film. But
yeah, well, I know.
Do you think The Shining went in? Oh, sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say real quick. I know that Nathan on the last site on the Schmeitz poll that you had, which is a fun. It's always fun to say. It sounds like I have marbles in my mouth. Texas Chainsaw Massacre wasn't that in the top 10?
Yeah, it actually did. I don't know the exact place, but it was in the top 10, I think, which it had done well in the previous years that I did that poll. But I was really surprised to see it go up significantly. I think higher than any other horror movie. I mean, I'm sure in having done that poll for like 3 years now, one thing you definitely see is that like recent deaths of directors kind of skew things a bit. So I think that Tobe Hooper's passing has probably like given it a push, and people are thinking about it more, and it's on the brain a little bit more. But it was the highest ranking horror movie on that list.
Yeah. But sorry, Lydia, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to ask if you think something like The Shining went in so high because it's like canonically known as a really, really great horror film. Because I mean, one of the things you found, Nathan, when you did this list was you got a bunch of people voting that maybe weren't necessarily from film Twitter, or just somehow they found out about it. And so like a lot of the list skewed, I don't know, standard. It's a horror film list, so it's already going to be a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did notice when I first put out the call, it was more like esoteric for sure. So I was seeing things like lots of Kiyoshi Kurosawa movies were like in the top 10 as I was counting them. Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, which still made the list, actually, was like very, very high. But then as the ripple kind of expanded, the top 10 is pretty, I guess you'd say it's a typical canonical selection, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself. But like, for instance, something like Rosemary's Baby. I don't know how well that film has actually aged in a grand scheme from my point of view. I think the novel holds up a lot better, but I mean, that's just my opinion. I don't know. What do you guys think?
It is interesting to see sort of the spread of foreign films, foreign language films. I guess really you have Argento in the top 10, and then I don't think there's another. I think the next foreign language film was Possession at 23, and then Pulse at 24. So it's just that I think that's always like interesting to observe. I mean, obviously, like the list does really skew towards American and English language films, which is sort of a given. I think with a lot of just with people online, you're going to have a more recent skew and probably more American skew. So it's interesting to see how that kind of plays out in the list. I mean, really, it's like, like you said, Kiyoshi Kurosawa does well. But there really aren't a lot of other like directors consistently showing up, other than like Argento, and Fulci shows up a few times, and Bava. Yeah, but like in terms of
Rob Zombie shows up
non-American stuff, there's like a select few. It feels like kind of coming up again and again.
Just kind of going through the top 10 just right now. You also, the oldest movie in the top 10 is Psycho at 1960, and then you have 1968 Rosemary's Baby, and then after that it's predominantly the 70s and then 82 with The Thing. I mean, I feel like that's kind of telling in itself that range of from 1960 to 1982 had so many, at least what this list is saying, as seminal horror movies.
Yeah, certainly. It's a very it's skewed more toward the second half of the 20th century and early 21st too. There's a lot of recent stuff on here.
There is.
The Witch came in at 18.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's so recent. It's hard to say where that'll fit into like the grand narrative. I'm personally not a fan of The Witch at all. I'm sorry to people who do like that movie, and I know a lot of people loved that film. It didn't connect with me at all.
Andrew's crying right now, so it's good.
I'm just glad Quiet Place didn't make it on.
Yeah, Quiet Place didn't make it on. I was kind of. You weren't a fan of that either. I didn't like it.
Okay.
But like Hereditary came out like 2 weeks before I put this out, and it's in like the top. It's pretty high, right?
Yeah, it's like in the top 30, I think.
It's at 43. Oh my god, that's surprising.
And It Follows is really high too.
I do like It Follows though.
And I was actually surprised that The Descent was so high. Like I know I still haven't seen that. I know there are a lot of people who like that movie, but it's at number 33, and that really stood out to me as like that's surprising. And then you have The Babadook at 34 and Get Out at 35, which is very, I mean, yeah, it's like those, a real kind of inflation, I think, just because those movies are in the discourse and in the sort of popular consciousness. I really wonder where they will settle over time. But are there any titles that any of you guys were really either like surprised to see made it on the list or were so high on the list, or are there any that you were surprised didn't make it on the list?
I think my initial surprise was just kind of working off my point of that kind of point in time having so many influential films on the list. It seems like pre-1950s really didn't have too much showing. I'm looking now, you have like Nosferatu and Bride of Frankenstein. Then there's
Jux Torner got on there, tied for the 43rd place.
Yeah, he had two, but and you had Vampire, which we talked about earlier this year on Young Critics, but I don't know. Maybe that's just more telling that some of those movies I don't know if it's people haven't seen them or it doesn't resonate with people today. I don't know what the answer would be, but I'm surprised by that just because I know we've watched a couple early horror movies for Young Critics, and I think that we've all generally seen, like, we've received them pretty well.
I mean, it's got to reflect the age of the people responding to the poll, right?
Yeah, and I realized even, I was thinking a lot doing this list, and then more recently sort of in October in the season of watching a lot of horror movies, just how little I have seen sort of like classical era, pre-Psycho horror. I wonder if part of that is just because sometimes I think for a lot of people the criteria is still kind of like what movies scare me the most, and I feel like a lot of people do sort of feel a distance from older horror films, even though there are a lot of films that I think are still really effective and really scary. But for myself personally, like a lot of times the movies, looking at my own ballot, some of these movies don't scare me at all, and that's not really my criteria necessarily for what I'm thinking of as a good horror movie. So I wonder if maybe that kind of impacts it too, what people's specific criteria are for what they think is like a great horror movie.
I think that's a really good point, Nathan. And that's something I wanted to touch on in the introduction, is that the role of affect, because it's I think it's the only genre named after affect. So people actually think like, well, which films horrify me? But I think if we can expand the definition a little bit, like it opens it up a lot. And maybe that could speak to why a lot of more recent films rank so highly, because they're speaking to contemporary and very current fear triggers in a sense. Yeah.
I also, oh gosh, what was I about to say? In your introduction, you talk about how there were votes for a number of movies that most people would not on site consider horror movies, but do sort of have that kind of horrifying, terrifying affect. Are there any of those sort of films, like you mentioned examples like Dunkirk and like Ernest Goes to Jail or School or whichever one of those movies, and I was wondering if there were any of those that like made it onto the actual list, like things that maybe are not considered horror necessarily, or if there were anything, if there's anything that didn't make it onto the actual list but got a number of votes, just because that seems like so personal, like to say Dunkirk scares me, so I'm going to put it on my list. Like it feels like a very sort of personal, effective thing. So I'm assuming that most of those titles like didn't get multiple votes.
Actually, Dunkirk got a few votes,
really?
Weirdly enough. Yeah, that got, I think, 3 or 4 votes, which even still, that surprised me. I was kind of interested to see how many votes Lynch got, because I've always thought of him within the kind of framework of horror, but I feel like conventionally he's not often, I feel like people are a little bit timid about reining Lynch in within the confines of genre, but I actually love thinking of him as a horror auteur,
All his films scare me. That makes sense.
Yeah, they're terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other, at least working filmmaker who I think scares me as much as his movies do. But I think that there are a few of his movies. Like I don't know if I ended up voting for Inland Empire, but Lost Highway made it onto the list, and I was thinking about voting for that one as well. And that sort of has that sort of blurring of genre boundaries. And I think Fire Walk with Me did very well, but I think that's a very terrifying movie, but it does also sort of skew those lines a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This might be, kind of an in the weeds talk, but I know it was kind of interesting talking with Nathan about his poll. Just the aggregating process once people start sending you in entries. I know he talked about this year especially, he was just like overwhelmed with all of the people sending in their list. What was that like for you, just trying to corral all of these lists coming in from Twitter and various other sources?
Well, let me start off by apologizing for tagging Nathan in my initial post. Oh my God. Okay. I immediately, I was like, okay, this blew up. I was thinking like, I don't know if people are going to engage with it at all. I just didn't really know what to expect because I've never done anything like this. And I feel like when I initially reached out to you, Nathan, you kind of told me, you're like, yeah, I got a lot of engagement. And for whatever reason, I was like, no, it won't be that bad. But I think I got, I think it was something like over 500 ballots altogether, well over 1,000 individual titles. So it was timely for sure. But it was interesting because in the early stages, I thought like it was weird. I'd be like, oh yeah, Halloween 2's doing really great. And then I would see them slip down as I was counting. So I saw it kind of forming organically, which was cool.
Yeah, that was my experience with the Schmeit and Schman list of like the first couple of days of aggregating ballots. You know, that's like Southland Tales or something like is doing really well, and then just at a certain point, you know, as I get deeper and deeper into the ballots, things just sort of settle, and it's like, you know, Vertigo has like 120 votes, and it's probably like stuck in its fixed in a position and not going to move. So it's interesting. Like, I wish there was a way that people could sort of, maybe there is like some kind of way for people to follow along, because I think it's really interesting to watch that happen in real time as you're inputting the data.
I agree. I was just thinking too, I noticed the same thing with The Shining, and I was thinking like, why is it that The Shining is so high this time around? I feel like in the past it's usually The Exorcist, but I feel like if there's any film that's being imitated most often in contemporary horror, especially that kind of I guess prestige or elevated horror movement, it's The Shining. That film right now is just so much in the consciousness, and I don't know why that is.
I guess you kind of have that. Speaking to like the elevated horror movement, whatever you would like to refer to it as, you have that kind of auteur drivenness to it. With, I mean, because you have with The Shining, you have Kubrick doing it, and it feels like that's kind of the element that they're trying to bring to these elevated horror movies. This almost auteurist approach, but at the same time, it's strange because I feel like to an extent it's also, I mean, some of it's like it's almost like a studio auteurism, like you think of with Hereditary. It feels much more in line with like the A24 aesthetic more than Ari Aster doing his own thing, and with not really Get Out, but some of the Blumhouse movies feel like more of a Blumhouse auteurist, you know, aesthetic rather than being the specific directors. And so I guess that's kind of where it's speaking to, where I guess people just don't value somebody like Tobe Hooper or strangely John Carpenter in the same way. Like John Carpenter's it seems like with him, like Kubrick, they kind of want to capture the aura of him and kind of work in that sphere. When John Carpenter, it's like they want to take his content and just kind of copy it over and not necessarily make it their own, but they just kind of want to have that whatever that mojo that he has that makes his film so engaging. And it's weird because I there's a lot of movies that kind of they want to compare it to, oh, this is like a John Carpenter-esque movie, and it seems like there's kind of a disconnect on what that means and what filmmakers are doing with that.
And it feels like there's one of the things that you talk about, Mike, a lot in your introduction is like the sort of the need for horror to still be upsetting and to still sort of push a certain amount of boundaries and have that sort of disreputable quality for it to be effective in the way that it historically has been. And I wonder too if like something like The Shining being so high is just because of the openness of a poll like this, where, you know, for so long horror has sort of been cloistered in its own little world, and the sort of the discourse and the canons are really fan driven. And so it's like the people who are very invested in horror are the people creating the narrative of horror. But now it's there's I guess sort of a time of you know, the genre shifting, and there are a certain amount of people now who will see something like Hereditary who may not have been a horror fan or devotee in a previous era. So I wonder if something like The Shining is like, it has that sort of non-genre appeal. You know, it appeals to, like, you know, a really serious Kubrick fan, you know, so I wonder if maybe that has something to do with it too. I'm sure there are other movies on the list that probably could be affected by the same thing.
Yeah, that's a really good insight. I think that speaks to part of my hang up about The Shining, which again is a movie I really admire, and it's actually a movie I quite like as well. But I feel like there's a way in which Kubrick seems to distance himself from the material. There's almost And I feel like people too often use terms like detached and cold to describe Kubrick's sensibility, and those are kind of lazy terms. But there is something to be said for that in The Shining, in that he almost clinically assesses the material that is originally quite personal and quite aggressive. Actually, that the novel is quite aggressive and I guess maybe more affect driven in a sense. Yeah, I don't know. It's a movie I grapple with. I don't know what to make of The Shining. I return to it every now and then, and it's a movie I struggle with.
I think, Nathan, about your point, like people, how do I say this? Not like elevated horror, but horror that does have a strong auteur spin or is like really well made or whatever. Because looking at this list, I don't see really anything that's just straight trash. Or maybe I have a skewed definition of what I think trashy is now because I love horror. But like most of the things on here are like actual movies, like well made and like by well-known directors, at least in the horror scene.
Yeah, it does feel like a lot of movies that it's I think this is one of the I think this is something that I kind of saw with the Schmeit and Schmound list too, is that a lot of times, and I guess this is just the sort of way that cinephilia now goes and kind of how the dice roll, but it's really, there are quite a number of movies on this list and on that my list too that I did by auteurs and by people who have this like really defined voice, and there are not a lot of movies by sort of just like, I don't know, generic directors that haven't really been written about or talked about as auteurs.
I'm not seeing anything like cash in B movie, cynical, whatever. I mean, as far as like Roger Corman stuff. Or anything like that.
Well, I love some of Corman's movies, though, I gotta say.
I guess it's just I think it also has to do with the sort of like particular genre moment we're in, where like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre would have been thought of as a sort of depraved movie and another time, but now a lot of these movies are movies that have been like reassessed,
I think that's what I meant.
Like Halloween 3. Yeah. We're all on the same page. Yeah.
And I'm curious. I know Andrew, I think, mentioned this in his review of A Quiet Place, but I know in one interview that John Krasinski did while talking about that movie was that he looked at a lot of the kind of recent, quote, elevated horror movies like The Get Out, The Witch, It Follows, like those movies. Yeah, but that was kind of what influenced him when he was making A Quiet Place. And so I'm curious if I don't know, this is just more of an abstract question, but how do you feel like that will influence the horror output in the next few years? I mean, just looking at the list, we've already mentioned that a lot of recent stuff like The Witch and It Follows and Hereditary have made this canon list already in the top 50. I wonder if you see I wonder if directors are going to be more like John Krasinski and be looking to this very recent sphere, and that's going to be kind of influential on what we're seeing for the next 5 or 10 so years from horror movies, at least ones that are studio.
10 years. I hope not. I've had enough of this stuff. I don't know. I probably sound too negative about it all. I don't know. I'd be curious if any of the films from this recent, I don't know what you'd call it, cycle or
cycle.
Speak to any of you guys. Cycle, I guess. I mean, I like some of them. I'm blanking right now on which ones, but I'm sure. I'm sure that.
I mean, I would say like I did like The Witch. I liked Get Out.
Get Out was good. I like Get Out.
Yeah, but I just feel like it's kind of interesting that like those would be what's influencing him, when I feel like a lot of these top 10 movies like The Shining, like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like Alien, like Halloween, like those were what were influencing a lot of directors heading into this kind of the cycle before. I'll just be curious to what that influence from the more contemporary cycle would be doing to what's next, and whether that's good or bad.
I think I feel like there's a certain tradition of horror that in this sort of cycle is being excluded. You know, if you look at like Ari Aster, who did Hereditary, like the movies he references in interviews are all, I feel like, come from a sort of certain tradition of horror movies, like Roman Polanski and Don't Look Now and movies like that, which feel sort of like of this more I don't know. I don't really know what term to give to these movies, but what they aren't doing is like they don't have this sort of focus on the body that I think we saw a lot in kind of the 2000s, and a lot of the really graphic horror movies being produced in that decade. Since there's been this turn away from that kind of content, I feel like horror has sort of like retracted to kind of the mind and is like, because all of these movies are really cloaked in very, supernatural stuff and sort of haunted house stuff, and they're cloaked in these very, intentional metaphors. And it's this sort of like mind versus body problem, I guess, of the genre. And I don't know. I feel like there's something that's really lost in that, because I feel like horror has the capacity to tell us about our sort of like the relationship we have as human beings with our own bodies and with our own physical reality as something that's really unique to horror. And so I feel like that's lost a little bit when horror movies are just like metaphors about families and stuff. Like,
I don't know. I think when people, how do I say this? Like when people go back to really putting the time and effort into scary, gross, practical effects, because a lot of the stuff like early 2000s and now I guess the scares are digital or atmospheric, and they're not doing just like really gross body things. I noticed that there's no Eli Roth on this list, and I was thinking Hostel when you said early 2000s, like torture porn stuff.
Yeah, that is something. I know Mike and I are both, I'm a sort of recent convert to the Eli Roth auteurism. But he is somebody who has not, we were talking about like movies that have been reassessed. He is not someone who has had his day in court. Maybe so. Maybe we're changing the tide,
Yeah, I like that Roth is. I feel like so much of the this cycle of whatever you want to call it, prestige or elevated horror or whatever, isn't doing much to disrupt. And I like horror that's disruptive and destabilizing, and that's what I like about Roth, is that he's intensely combative as a filmmaker. So I don't leave his films necessarily feeling like I can resolve what they're doing ideologically, but I like that about them.
Yeah.
Hostel did get a few votes, but not many.
I feel like that kind of works off of the whole elevated horror point that we are kind of making, because to me it feels like almost when you go into this movie that's being billed this way, I definitely felt it when I went and saw Hereditary earlier this year. It's like when you walk in the theater, you're given a sheet of this is what we're trying to accomplish in terms of psychological strife and all that stuff, and that's just,
I mean, the most disturbing image in Hereditary is a practical effect. Like, it's a prop and grossness.
Yeah, and so it seems like horror movies, you know, for so long have been able to weave in these themes and engage with these, you know, social and political and psychological issues. But now I think that there is a degree of like they're very upfront about it, and I don't know. I guess after rewatching you know, some of George Romero's work earlier this year, I think I can kind of appreciate the ways that he is weaving in his commentary compared to what something like Hereditary or even to an extent It Follows does. That seems very, very overt with what it's trying to say. I don't know if that's good or bad. That's just me.
It feels like a sort of. It also feels like a sort of shift to like a focus on the individual, as opposed to like Romero is dealing with a larger social context, but something like Hereditary is like a much smaller focus, which I think there's a place for that, but I also want some of the opposite, which is why I like Eli Roth, is because I don't really know ever what he's saying exactly, but he's like tapping into something going on and like has his finger on the pulse of the moment in a way that a lot of other filmmakers don't, and is trying to wrestle with some broader societal problems. So
yeah, who else is working on that register? Like even Get Out, I would say, was gesturing to bigger social issues, but it was still pretty locked into the specific and the personal, I think. And in a way, it had to be by virtue of its plot. But yeah, I don't know if there are any other working horror auteurs aside from Eli Roth that are grappling so explicitly with those kind of broader socio-political issues. I don't know.
Nathan, I'm curious because I know that you're very very strong on M. Night Shyamalan. Do you feel like there should have been a little bit more Shyamalan love? I'm trying to look real quickly. Was he in the top 50?
So we have two movies. They're tied. Split and The Sixth Sense are tied at 97. And I think this sort of relates to some things that we have been talking about, of this sort of like the borders and peripheries of the genre, because I think Shyamalan is sort of complicated, you know, because he's drifting back and forth between horror and melodrama and sometimes getting into science fiction. And it's this sort of murky. Yeah, and it's this like murky territory, and like The Sixth Sense and Split, I feel like more than any other movies in his filmography, I guess The Visit too, those are like the most, I feel like, explicitly like in the language of horror. And I think that the other ones, I guess, actually now I'm walking this statement back, The Happening in The Village too. But I don't know. It's. I feel like he's in that kind of murky territory, and sometimes like something like Signs, you know, is on the border of science fiction and horror, and it's like it is a very, very terrifying movie, but it has aliens in it, and it's also like a family drama. So I think it maybe is just a movie that doesn't like spring to most people's minds. I don't know. I think there should be more Shyamalan. I'm sure, Mike, I know you also love M. Night Shyamalan, so I'm sure you agree with that. I think I put Split on my ballot, but I also was thinking about The Happening too.
I was just thinking because Split was just so well received, and kind of he almost had a rejuvenation of, oh yeah, M. Night Shyamalan. We almost forgot about him.
He's been almost having a rejuvenation for a long time.
I think that Split at least put him over the edge to an extent, and I'm surprised that people haven't gone and reevaluated a lot of his other stuff, and it found its way on this list. That's just surprising to me, just with how much I see of kind of love for him as a director on film Twitter, especially.
Yeah. I also think too, it's like Split is the least probably sentimental of his movies. I mean, it is a very emotional movie, but it's not in the sort of way that people accuse of being really corny or really sappy, you know, like some of his earlier movies are. It sort of sheds the whole like Spielberg thing that people saw in his earlier movies completely. And is like very, I mean, you have the cinematographer from It Follows. So it's like very, I think, in a contemporary kind of register for what people are maybe expecting from horror now.
That's true.
So,
before we kind of wrap up on this discussion, I'm curious on what you all had on your lists, and if you felt like some of them should have been much more highly ranked, just because you personally are like, yeah, this is a much better movie than a lot of the ones that were ranked either below it or above it.
I know. I'm pleased with my list because 9 out of my 10 got on. Man, I don't know. I am in step with horror film Twitter. The only one that didn't get on is Jennifer's Body, which is kind of sad because it's so much fun.
Yeah, that's a movie that I feel like should be here. It would be on mine. I'm looking right now to see how many. There are 7 movies from my ballot on the list. The few that are not on the list are Slumber Party Massacre, Choi Hark's We're Going to Eat You, which is just a general thing, like people always overlook Hong Kong's horror movies. Like, I mean, part of it is an accessibility thing, but in terms of like actually getting the movies. But I think that there's a lot there. And Phantom of the Paradise also is not on the list. So
I feel like that's another one, like we've been talking about, that's threading a couple lines that maybe makes it murky.
Sorry, guys, I got disconnected for a moment. Did I miss anything?
No, we're gonna put you on the spot and ask what your list was that you submitted.
Okay, I just pulled it up. I had Nosferatu, The Black Cat, which did make it on at the end. I was happy to see that.
Squeezed on.
Bride of Frankenstein, which made it quite high. Terrence Fisher's The Curse of the Werewolf. A Bay of Blood by Mario Bava. I don't know if that one made it. I can't remember.
I saw Bava's name. I don't remember.
No, it didn't make it on there.
Didn't make it? No. Torso by Sergio Martino. I think that only got like 2 other votes. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
Prince of Darkness. Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Retribution, and The Lords of Salem.
Nice. I think my list, though, because this was like July or June, that I submitted my ballot, and I've been watching so many horror movies in the last 2 months that I feel like I've seen a number of movies recently that could find a spot on that ballot in the future if you do it again.
Cool. Well, for those who would like to check out the full list,
Zach, what about your ballot? Hold on.
Oh, I actually never submitted a ballot.
Whoa.
Oh, no?
I did not, no.
What would be on it?
I would just put I'm trying to think. What's the most
I feel
annoying...
like you would probably put
Alien 10 times.
Haven't you given Dawn of the Dead like 5 stars on Letterboxd? I feel like that.
Actually, you know what I would put really high that wasn't high on this list is I would put Night of the Hunter, which is a terrifying movie that maybe you wouldn't categorize as a horror movie. No, I'd have that. I would have that. I mean, I've been watching a bunch of it lately, but The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which I feel like is kind of one of those canonical ones already, but it does have this just kind of otherworldly element to it. I rewatched Halloween before we went and saw the new Halloween at TIFF, and I hadn't seen it since I was like in middle school or something, and kind of
it's scary.
Yeah, and I was just super. I got really obsessed with that movie. It's one of those architecture movies where I love the layout and design of the space that we're using for like the hour or so that the attacks are happening. Like the way that John Carpenter just works that. I just fucking love that. I love the same thing with Dawn of the Dead, just the structure of the mall and how the zombies and bikers are being filtered through that, and how a lot of the scares and a lot of the thrills just come from the way that the space is structured. I really dig those in horror movies because it still scares you, but there's something very thrilling about understanding the architecture of the house or the wherever you're at, and so that whenever the killer or whoever is around, you're aware of where he or she could be, but it's something that's I find very interesting in Halloween. I feel like it's just such a perfect example of that. I watched The Exorcist a couple years ago, and so I would agree with having that so highly, but I watched it alone at night in an apartment where I live alone, and that was a terrible decision.
How do you feel about the Blair Witch Project? Because
I did not like the Blair Witch Project at all. And there is a podcast. There is a podcast with evidence on how much I did not like that. And then naturally, I'd have Jaws really high up because I do love Jaws, and I'll be writing about Jaws. So cool. That would be my list. I feel like, though, I would stray from a lot of the contemporary stuff, though, that made here. I mean, like we said before, I like them, but I mean, the fact that Hereditary is already on this list is astounding to me. But I think the most recent horror movie that I would even consider putting on some sort of canon list would be The Babadook, which was at 34. But that's just me. Well, you can find the list. It's on cinematary.com right now. And everybody, please tweet at Mike and say thank you so much for putting this together. It's I know just from talking with Nathan about his own poll that it's a large undertaking. So we appreciate you taking the time and letting us post it on the site.
Oh, no, it was cool. It was fun doing that with you guys.
We're going to take a short break. We'll be back talking about a movie that's not on this list, but the original film is on this list at number 26, and that's The Rage Carrie 2. So we'll be talking about that in part 2 after this break.
Hey, Cinematariats. This is your co-host Lydia Creech with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we do not want your money, and we don't want to place ads in the show at this time either. That's not why we do this. We do it because we enjoy each other's company, and we want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema. However, there are a few things you can do to help out the show that we would greatly appreciate. First, leave us a review on iTunes, 4 or 5 stars only, to help us reach more listeners per the algorithm gods. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send us an email at zach@cinematary.com. That's Zach, Z-A-C-H, so we can hear from you guys for a change. I'd especially like to hear if you're a human and not an android who also likes Blade Runner, or maybe you have a suggestion of a movie you would really like to hear our opinions on. Regardless, let us know your thoughts and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes of the show. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think would enjoy listening to and participating in our film discussions that we bring to you guys every week. So, to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, and please share with your friends and family. We would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Now back to the show.
Episode 217 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Horror by Women series with 1999's The Rage, Carrie 2. Directed by Kat Shea, from a script by Raphael Moreau. These film stars Emily Burgle, Jason London, Dylan Bruno, J. Smith Cameron, and Amy Irving. When her closest friends commit suicide after being manipulated by the popular crowd, quiet and bookish Rachel Lang decides to get back at the guilty parties. Although Rachel falls for sensitive football player Jesse Ryan, she remains determined to punish his callous friends. When Rachel discovers that she has superhuman abilities, it ups the stakes for her revenge, echoing a supernatural incident that occurred decades before. The movie was originally titled The Curse, and it was scheduled to start production in 1996 with Emily Bergel in the lead role. However, it stalled for 2 years. The plot heavily borrows from a real-life 1993 incident in which a group of high school jocks known as the Spur Posse were involved in a sex scandal. The group came to national attention on March 18, 1993, when the LA County Sheriff's Department arrested a number of the members for various sexual crimes. Prosecutors later dropped all but one of the charges after being unable to prove most of the encounters were non-consensual, although many were with underage girls, some as young as 10. One girl who was later interrogated by police said she had been in bed late one night when a teenager appeared at her window and demanded sex from her. Police had the opportunity to prosecute the considerably older boys for statutory rape and declined to do so. In 1998, the film finally went into production under the title Carrie 2, Say You're Sorry. A few weeks into production, director Robert Mandel quit over creative differences, and Kat Shea hurriedly took over the reins with less than a week to prepare for the start of filming and 2 weeks worth of footage to reshoot. Shea was told that she would not be able to use footage of Sissy Spacek from the original Carrie, but she edited several scenes into the film and presented the film to Spacek, who granted permission for her likeness to be used, even though she declined to cameo. Amy Irving reprised the role of Sue Schnell, which she originated in the first Carrie, but which, though she was initially wary of taking the role, and asked Brian De Palma, director of the original film, for his blessing. In 1999, we got 3 reviews. Variety says, the case for leaving beloved older picks unmolested by remaking is bolstered once again.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
Yeah. Word choice.
I know, right? By remaking is bolstered once again by the Rage Carrie 2, an update as generic in every aspect as Brian De Palma's original was inventive. The AV Club said, but as unnecessary as The Rage is, it still has quite a bit going for it. Shea makes the film's hellish high school environment seem believable, evoking sympathy for her heroine in ways more complicated than mere pity, something De Palma didn't quite pull off. The romance between Bergel and a sweet if suspiciously post-collegiate-looking renegade football player works as well, and the over-determined grand finale delivers some truly visceral thrills. Unfortunately, however, the flashbacks to the superior original provide frequent reminders that as either a first-rate ripoff or a second-rate sequel, The Rage doesn't quite measure up. Roger Ebert said that the original Carrie worked because it was a skillful teenage drama grafted onto a horror ending. Also, of course, because De Palma and his star Sissy Spacek made the story convincing. The Rage Carrie 2 is more like a shadow. On that note, let's talk a little bit about this film, and I guess let's start with kind of the comparisons to the original film. I saw, looking through a lot of the reviews, the contemporary reviews for it, it seemed like people really grafted it and were just going, yeah, this is just, taking from the original and just kind of pasting it into a new updated environment, which seems to be the plight of many sequels. So I guess let's first talk about just kind of it being a sequel from Carrie. Do you feel like it is just leaning too heavily on the first movie to kind of make its plot run, or does it kind of divert away and do its own thing?
I think it does its own thing. I will say, I guess when it does lean on the first Carrie, the math squicks me out, because I guess Carrie and Rachel have the same dad. And I'm like,
yeah, that doesn't make sense to me.
That's kind of gross. I don't know what's happening. But I think also the Sue character is a pretty good addition. It's like, oh, she witnessed this really horrible shit and it traumatized her as a teenager, and she's desperate for it to not happen again. And so you got this like little mini tragic arc with her. Yeah,
I think it has a very tenuous connection to the first movie other than the Amy Irving character. Because the Rachel and Carrie are stepsisters or whatever, and they're so different. I mean, they're very different in a lot of ways. I mean, in the first one, Carrie is brutalized and abused by her evangelical, crazy, gothic mother, who and in this one, like, she seems like a fairly, I mean, she's this goth outsider, you know, not popular, but she's
cute.
not. She like seems to be, you know, in a much better position than Carrie was in her high school. And so, you know, there's a lot of differences, but Lydia, I totally agree. Like, in the use of bringing back the Sue character, I feel like is really effective because you have that like really palpable feeling of guilt. And I even feel like the flashbacks to the first movie for me are actually pretty effective, just in sort of thinking about them as these like memories. I don't know. It doesn't like remind. It doesn't like. I mean, I really like the first movie, but when I see those flashbacks, I don't think, wow, I wish like I was watching that much better movie. Like, I'm totally content.
Watching. Yeah. I think we've been talking a lot about post-traumatic stress in like all of the Halloween sequels. And then I wondered about it with like Texas Chainsaw. And I was like, here's a character that like had to go to therapy for a very long time. And now she's trying to help this other girl. So that's a PTSD response. And also the tormentors are different. In Carrie, she's tormented by other women. She's tormented by her mother. She's tormented by the girls in the locker room. And then like the dude she dates is just like sweet and kind of dumb. And like in Carrie 2, the tormentors are like all the asshole high school boys.
This one also, to me, felt like it was very much in touch with its specific historical moment. Like, I was noticing the Marilyn Manson sticker in her friend's locker, and the Manson and Nine Inch Nails posters in the protagonist's bedroom. And I was thinking, oh, this was right around the time that Columbine happened. In addition to that context of the awful incidents that we brought up at the beginning that inspired the plot. So, yeah, to me, it felt like this is very much a late 90s milieu. And like Nathan brought up, even the goth aesthetic as well. It didn't feel at all to me like a retread of anything in the original. It felt to me like a completely new thing.
And I feel like this movie is really working in the sort of aesthetic language of like 90s teen movies. It has a very different style from the first movie, even though the first movie does have the sort of teen movie elements to it. It's like, you know, De Palma is doing sort of really like, you know, the long tracking shots and the sort of the soft focus, like, you
and
know,
he's
using all of his stylistic hallmarks. And here, like, it's not, you know, some aesthetically barren movie, but it's a very different style. I mean, I honestly feel like it has a little bit more stylistically in common with Lynch, like in the scenes where the rage is starting to set into her, like the camera starts shaking and sort of going in and out very, very quickly in this jittery kind of way. And even like Zach, you and I were before we started recording, you mentioned that a few of the guys in this movie were also in the American Pie movies. And then you have like one of the main guys from Dazed and Confused is the like nice jock boyfriend. So you have these people, you know, who are like in other straight, you know, comedy teen romances or whatever. So I think that like gives it something else, that it's sort of straddling these two genres.
Yeah, and I think, and I mentioned this in the first half, and it was really sparing with like terrible CGI effects. Like there were some shots that looked bad, but then when they'd cut back to it, it was like a practical blood and like glass sticking out of prosthetics.
Yeah, you've got those.
So. It still looks really good, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, first, like the opening with Rachel's mother, like painting the walls of the house, is a really like striking opening. But then also you have just some really bonkers gore effects towards the end with the like the CDs that she's throwing with her mind powers. Is another great like period touch too.
And it's also like very much in conversation with that post-Scream moment too, right? Mm-hmm. With this kind of resurgence of teen horror and a kind of updating of what teen horror looks and feels like. And it even, I thought, had touches of that kind of meta obsession that Kevin Williamson brought to teen genre stuff around that time, with like the little Romeo and Juliet reference kind of seemed like a reflection on the text itself.
That seemed like out of Halloween too, like a teacher talking to his high school students about fate.
Yes, yeah.
Mike, I'm interested in hearing more about your feelings about the first movie, just as a really big Stephen King enthusiast. Do you see like any touches of King's vision at all in this movie, or is it like totally removed?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually just reread the novel for this podcast. I hadn't read it in probably 15 years, maybe.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it had been a long time, but I just reread the novel. I haven't seen the film in a few years, but I think the original film certainly captures the novel quite well. Something that struck me this time around that I had somehow forgotten is that King splices in these kind of non-fictional excerpts throughout the book, like from autobiographies reflecting on the incident and encyclopedia entries, newspaper clippings, and that sort of thing. I don't know how well they work in the novel. Like, yeah, it's interesting. I thought maybe this film, in terms of like tapping so directly into its contemporary moment, reflected that like engagement with reality. But yeah, in terms of the voice, it doesn't feel expressly Kingian to me, which is okay. I mean, it's a spin-off.
Yeah. I guess there could maybe be a little bit of a parallel to that sort of like non-fictional structure or devices, in just like this one has the sort of media specificity of cutting to like camcorder footage and the videotape and stuff, and then, you know, not so much like artifact of like authenticity within the movie itself, but you have the really interesting decisions to like cut in shots to like high contrast black and white that looks like it's maybe like shot on 16 millimeter or something. And it's like not, I don't know, it's like used in a very interesting way where it's just sort of like shot to shot. You'll just have this like other format cut in. I thought that was a really interesting stylistic decision.
I want to talk a little bit about Kat Shea as the director, because like I mentioned, she initially wasn't the first choice. They had a director who was there for a few weeks and then he jettisoned, so she kind of jumped in, and she had a, you know, solid, she was doing a lot of stuff prior to this movie. She had done Poison Ivy, what's the other
Poison Ivy
big movie that she did? She did Poison Ivy and I guess Streets and Dance of the Damned,
Stripped to Kill
and Stripped to Kill and Stripped to Kill too.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, just kind of inserting her into this story. Do you feel like kind of how she handles the quote Carrie character? Is it different from kind of how De Palma handles it in the original movie? Do you feel like that she is a little bit more sensitive to to Rachel as this lead protagonist with the kind of Carrie elements than what we got in the original movie?
I think so. Andrew wrote about this when he reviewed Carrie 2013, the actual remake, and he talked about that movie is a lot kinder to Carrie, or gives her a little bit more interiority or personality, because Sissy Spacek is just like abused and shy and closed off, which is understandable, but
yeah, she doesn't really have a lot of agency, I feel like. And I feel like Rachel has more
like seems okay. Like she had a rough childhood with her mom or whatever, but she's got like a really cute friendship with her best friend, and like doesn't seem to care that she's an outsider at school. She's comfortable with who she is.
Yeah, she reminded me more of characters like from the protagonist of Lucky McKee's May, or Ginger from Ginger Snaps. I was wondering if those films in some way were, I guess they wouldn't have been inspired by the success of this one because this wasn't a particularly successful film, but they all came out around the same moment, which is interesting to me. But yeah, much stronger character in a kind of like in a very obvious sense than Carrie is. And
it's also their, kind of the what incites the rage is like very different in each movies, in each movie. Because in the first one, it's like Carrie, like you said, Lydia, is abused. She has like no power of her own at all, total outsider. So she just like explodes. And in this one, it's like it's such a complicated, I think, sort of what the movie is dealing with content wise, because in the introduction you gave, Zach, it kind of like glosses over what happens to her friend, that she's sexually assaulted, and that they like totally one of the sons from Home Improvement plays the rapist who gets charged, but then the charges are dropped and he's like off scot-free, trying to get a football scholarship. His rich daddy pulled some strings, and then Rachel gets sort of absorbed into this world of these popular people who are ultimately just like trying to do the same thing to her. And she finds out that her like, seemingly better jock football player boyfriend, isn't like them. And it turns out he is exactly like them, and was just using her too. So I don't know. It's like a much more, I feel like, thematically complicated movie in some way.
I think what makes it even more complicated, like even she thought he was sweet, but it turns out he wasn't, is a lot more complicated than that, because maybe he actually is sweet, but he did participate in this fucked up sex game that they were playing, and he's like not really calling his friends out or trying to change them or step up for other women. And so like that's a really complicated response to have to, oh, you think your partner's a decent person, and like maybe he mostly is, but like weird ass blind splats that are,
I don't know. I think that I'll just go into defense mode for the person who's having a sex points list, but no. I feel like I feel like the jock boyfriend that she has at least does to an extent purge himself of the others once he begins dating Rachel. Like you do have those scenes where he's just kind of like,
so he has to have a relationship with a woman for a woman to be a person to him.
I guess Damn.
So. Like that's pretty indefensible.
We're just trying to see. We're trying to see some
both sides.
At least he has some degree of growth compared to anybody else in the movie. Outside of the lead character.
Did he make a mistake when he was 17? What's really nice about this movie is like all the shitty high school boys die, and like in real life they become Supreme Court justices. So
I know, and it's like you hear like the exact same sort of real life rhetoric of like, guys being guys, and right, and that like, oh, these things happen, it's just growing, it's part of life. So it's like feels uncomfortably prescient.
I did love the scene though where they were all shaving their heads and screaming, which I felt like if you looked in through like a dictionary for masculinity, like there would be that scene of just a bunch of football players shaving their heads and screaming and hitting each other. It was just homoeroticism at its peak.
Yeah, and there's the strange moment too where the coach sticks the tampon between the guys. Yeah, he lowers his pants. Yeah.
Oh, there was
a bizarre moment.
I noticed there was like a lot of male nudity. We've talked about Stephanie Rothman's rules for her exploitation films, And like the original Carrie, you have that shower scene basically at the beginning with Ogly, and I'm like, that didn't happen here. And in fact, we got the opposite. Like in the football where the dudes are just showering, and it's weird.
The other thing I was kind of curious about, and I guess this kind of goes back to the point on connecting it as a sequel, because one of the things I saw, I was reading a contemporary review on the site Bloody Disgusting, kind of looking back at the film and how, even though it as a kind of Carrie, you know, it's not really a franchise, but like as a within the Carrie franchise umbrella or whatever you want to describe it as, it's it kind of fails. But the reviewer said that as its own movie, it's very effective, and that it really does play into that kind of the contemporary setting that it's using. And that was one of the things that I found to be really effective, was just the I think I told Nathan, it kind of felt at times like a Linkin Park music video, which is a giant compliment. Like I loved those points of it. Like it just it was so unabashedly like 90s, and I kind of love the ending, which we can talk about, or like the ending of like the whole chaos murder party, because I don't know, I love that the movie was just in complete like F you, like F everybody mode, and there was no like, it was just take no prisoners type thing. It was just all like the whole thing's burning down, we're going down with the old I don't know. I see a lot of movies treading that line of like burning everything down, but then choosing not to. And this one went full steam ahead on just taking the whole thing and just burning it all down. I mean, for God's sake, we have Amy Irving who's like reprising this role as Sue Snell, and she gets a brutal death in that, very unceremoniously. Yeah, she's like coming there to help, and it's just like
she didn't really deserve it.
Spiked through the head. I was really shocked by that. What did you guys make of just kind of the violence in the whole murder party fire, whatever you'd like to call it, murder party?
I love that it went there. Like I think you're right that it didn't. I like that it actually had the will to go to those places that a lot of certainly studio horror films don't go, and even by the late 90s, I think they were starting to tamper quite a bit, and I think definitely now we see that big time. But yeah, I thought that final sequence was extraordinarily brutal, but it was the movie's benefit.
I think it's like, especially maybe when this movie came out, but still today, there are not a whole lot of movies that really allow women this kind of like intense anger and capacity to like do these things, and to take this sort of violent revenge.
It felt really justified here. People have said in the original Carrie that because Sissy Spacek is so weird and her reaction is so like extreme, and you maybe feel like some of those kids don't deserve it, but the Rage does a really good job being like, no, they kind of deserve this, and like just letting her have this justified anger without really turning her into like a weirdo space monster, sort of.
And I think that another very interesting difference between these two is that in the first one, you have this very spiritual element to it. Like Carrie is growing up in this intense religious household where like the fear of God is a very real thing, where the hell really like burns you. And this one like totally strips that away. It's not like Satan or whatever in Rachel. It's her like telekinesis gene, which sort of reminded me of like, this movie also coming out in 1999 reminded me of like the midi-chlorians and the Phantom Menace. Just because it's like, no, this isn't some like supernatural thing. This is like your DNA, is you have this predisposition to destroy things with your mind. So it's like, I think that kind of goes along with this sort of like total unabashed nihilism of the movie, that it's like totally stripping out the religious and the kind of the supernatural and the spiritual, and like this is all very real, both on a level of like what it's pulling from real life, the kind of the issues the movie's dealing with, and in this violence which comes from a totally scientific place.
It's a good point, and I feel like the original film probably made a deliberate choice not to include that scientific aspect, I suppose, because the novel, like I said, has those kind of artifacts, those newspaper clippings and so on. And it does have some encyclopedia entries about the science behind telekinesis and so on. So De Palma made the decision to excise that from the film, which is interesting. But you're right, the religiosity, that was one thing I noted as well. I didn't really notice much religious imagery at all. The closest would be those kind of idols, the music posters and things like that, because Marilyn Manson has that kind of religiously laden
the Antichrist thing.
Yeah, exactly. But that's about it. That was like the only thing I can't remember much else.
You got the mother who kind of like clutches a rosary, but they stick her in an insane asylum for most of the movie, so she's not.
What did you guys make of the final actual ending rather than the ending of like the whole party scene? One, it kind of, that one threw me for a nice little shock. I watched that like late at night before I was like, I'm gonna watch this and then go to bed. That one threw me off a little bit. I was like, that was super spooky. I didn't really appreciate that, but it was funny whenever I was Googling to do research on the movie. Like the third or fourth Google entry was "The Rage Carrie 2 Ending Explained," which I didn't really want to see because I feel like that would take me to like some CinemaSins YouTube video. But I mean, what do you make of that whole kind of premonition, ghostly sequence?
It's kind of a callback to the original Carrie, too, except instead of being a cheapish jump scare, it's, I don't know, that dude seems like he deserves it. I mean, deserves to be haunted by this sort of girlfriend he had for like a week.
Yeah, I feel like I felt the same, it was just the sort of callback, but it also, I was like almost viscerally upset when before I realized that it was this fake out, because I was like, wait, why the fuck are they like getting like, no, like this movie totally undermined itself completely, destroyed everything it was going for by having them get together. And then I was like, okay, like good. We've taken it back. So this movie is actually good. Well, just the fact that I was like, for this movie to be as bold as it is, and then to have, because they embrace and like, and I was like, yeah, if she got back with like the nice,
she actually lived,
the air quotes nice but still shitty guy, like then the movie would have, the movie would have totally like,
he's a nice guy,
gone back on what it was trying to do and would have like totally failed, I think, to renege on that sort of bold, audacious ending. So I was glad that it was a fake out, and she's just a ghost or whatever. She's disappearing. I
just didn't like that she just went and then just dissolved. That's not. I'm not really good with that. That's the stuff that I'm like, no bueno.
No.
Any kind of final thoughts as before we wrap up on this chat? Anything that you would like to point out about this movie that we haven't?
They had matching friendship tattoos. That's so cute.
Oh yeah.
It's not scary. I just liked it.
Yeah, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it, especially like as a King fan. Like I feel like a lot of the spin-off film stuff is usually not very good at all. And I had never heard anything positive about this film at all. So I was surprised actually by how strong and thoughtful and complex it was. So
Yeah, I felt similarly. Like this movie had come on my radar, I think, because of friend of the podcast, Sydney Taylor. I had tried to find. I could have sworn she like wrote a little thing on Letterboxd about this movie. I couldn't find it. Maybe she deleted it, or maybe I just imagined it and read it elsewhere. But somebody else wrote something about this movie, and I had like never heard of it before. This was a few years ago, so it's sort of been on my radar, and I'd been wanting to see it. But I was very like same feeling, Mike, just kind of like very pleasantly surprised by it, that it is so much its like own thing and a very interesting thing at that. Yeah, it was. I mean, just I knew Andrew had watched it and had enjoyed it, so I was like, okay, I feel like I'll probably get something out of this. But I really liked it a lot more than I was anticipating.
Now I want to read Sydney Taylor's thoughts on it.
I know.
Yeah.
I also feel like it does a really good job of being this kind of cultural artifact for the 90s. It almost is stereotypical at moments in it, but I feel like there's also this genuine affection for just that kind of culture. It's like there's a really deep understanding of what 90s high school was, for good or bad, and I felt like that they did just a fantastic job of doing that. I know Andrew talked a little bit in his review of the movie on Letterboxd about how this movie captures high school really well. Yeah, I think that this could have been a movie that was kind of like an eye roll over the top 90s, just whatever. And I also really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. All right. Well, I believe that will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at handle @Cinematary, and on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we post all of the movies that we talked about in this episode. Next week on the pod, we will be continuing this series with 2009's Jennifer's Body, which was left off of the horror list, much to the chagrin of Lydia. Sorry, Lydia. But we'll talk about it. It'll be good. I'd also like to call to attention a series that Nathan spearheaded on the website for this month. If you want to look for some great writing on horror movies, we're not just covering them on the podcast. We have our Re-Fear series, where we're looking at sequels and remakes of horror movies. Nathan kicked it off with Return of the Living Dead from 1985. Andrew, like Lydia mentioned, wrote about Carrie, the 2013 version. And then today, we're recording this on Wednesday, we posted Reed Ramsey's review of the 1998 shot-for-shot remake of Psycho by Gus Van Sant. And that one is a very good read. I know Reed went back and watched the Psycho franchise, and he seemed to really dig a lot of these sequels that I feel like you would kind of forget about. I know he thought Psycho 3 was just a really fantastic movie on its own, but he has some good thoughts to add to to this remake, which I know is kind of a very one that gets kind of maligned a lot as just being terrible. I remember watching it and struggling to get with Vince Vaughn, what he's doing.
I love that film,
but that's been a while. I'll have to rewatch it. It's been a while. I watched it in college, and I just watched Psycho, and I was like, "This is heresy," kind of thing. I just felt like I've watched Psycho, and I know about movies. It's heresy. So I need to rewatch it. Anyway. Mike, thanks again for jumping on the podcast. Hopefully this is not the last time. We'll see you back on here. And, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you next week.